When it comes to morality, like right and wrong, tell me what you think. You hear people say all the time, I've got to follow my conscience. What does that mean? Does that mean that there's an objective moral norm that we can perceive in nature? Or is that just an excuse to do whatever I feel like doing? We'll talk about that next, but first, as always, we start with our mission. Today we're discussing moral law. What is it? Where does it come from? And how can we know it? If we learn this faith, if we live this faith, if we share this faith, what will the next 100 years look like? Join the mission. If you missed the previous video, this is part 6 in our series on Sister Mary O'Brien OP's great book, Christian Social Principles. You can get a copy of this book over at Sophia Press, and we highly recommend that you do. It's a great book. We like it so much that we're making this series on the first section of her book, chapters 1 through 8. This is video number 6 on chapter 6. In the last video, we spoke about the classical meaning of law, eternal law and natural law, and how they serve as guides in our pursuit of the good. Now, in this video, we're going to look at natural moral law, what it is, how we know it, and whether or not it changes from person to person. Now, we make videos just like this each week. So if you want more content like this, please like and subscribe so that you can get future videos. Now, in the last video, Sister explained that man needs law as a guide to get to where he wants to go. She used the example of a traveler, or the analogy of a traveler who needs a map. It's not enough that he knows where he's at and he knows where he wants to be, but he needs these guide points along the way so that he can mark his progress and make sure that he's going in the correct direction, that he's not going to get lost. Now, we're going to use that same concept here to talk about natural moral law, which relates to how we act. And the way we're going to proceed is we've already established that the goal of human life is happiness, and we've defined that as the perfection of our nature, that everything in creation, all natures, whether they're trees or dogs or birds or plants or humans, we've used these as our examples in the videos, all of these natures are seeking the fulfillment or the perfection of their natures. Now, each of these natures has a different fulfillment, but they're all moving towards that fulfillment. Now, the goal of human life is this fulfillment of our nature, which we call happiness. For humans, that fulfillment would be the fulfillment of our intellect, which is to know truth, and our wills, which is to pursue the good. So the fulfillment of our intellects would be this fulfillment of truth, and the fulfillment of our wills would be this fulfillment of the good, this perfection of the good. Now, we said before, these are not particular truth or a particular good. For example, a Lamborghini or a Ferrari or winning the lottery, those are particular goods, and they would make me happy for a temporary amount of time, but they would not perfect and fulfill everything that I am. At the end of the day, there would still be parts of me, there would still be aspects of me that were left unfulfilled. So we don't mean a particular happiness or a particular object like a Ferrari when we say that we're pursuing our happiness. So now, to get from here to there, law serves as a guide, and in the last video we spoke about God's eternal law, which is the idea in the mind of God that this order from here to there, where creatures are moving from where they're at to the fulfillment of their natures, this movement, we call that God's eternal law. Now, we cannot know the mind of God, but we can see it manifesting itself in creation around us. We can see that the apple tree bears apples, and the chick hatches from an egg laid from a chicken. We can see this order playing out around us. We call that order that is manifested in creation, we call that natural law. Now, the particular law that relates to what we do, our pursuit of the good, We specifically call that natural moral law because it's discussing what, or it relates to what it is that we're actually doing. So remember, we're discussing moral theology here, which is the relationship of how we do things. So there's this individual in front of me. Should I kill him or not? Would that be immoral? That's the subject matter here. So we've gone from God's eternal law to natural law, and now we're kind of getting down into the meat of the matter, natural moral law, what we do. Now, Sister's going to explain that there's 3 elements of natural moral law. It's this tendency. It starts with, number 1, with this tendency that we have, that we're moving towards our perfection. But since we're not like a tree or a chicken or what are the other examples I used? I forget. A dog. We are rational creatures. We have this intellect that is aware of this tendency. We're aware that I'm pursuing the lottery or I'm pursuing the Ferrari. We're aware that there's something about me that's pursuing and perhaps even planning out. Well, how do I win the lottery? Let's see. What numbers should I pick to win the lottery? I don't play the lottery. It's a good example right there. But anyways, so that's the second element. So the first is the tendencies towards the good, and the first is the tendencies toward the good. The second is that we're aware of that we can recognize that, we can reason through that. And then the third is that we have this desire in our will to actually pursue it. We have the desire, for example, the lottery. I have the desire to get in the car, drive to the store, and buy the lottery ticket. So those are the 3 elements of natural moral law. Now, very interesting here, and I had to kind of stop here when I saw this in the chapter and kind of reflect on this. She notes that it's only man who has freedom to pursue his end, to his perfection, right? So think about this for just a minute. All of those natures that we just spoke about, the tree, the dog, the chicken, all of these examples I gave, they are all pursuing, but none of them are making the choice to pursue. Each one of them is only doing what their nature guides them to do each and every day. We, on the other hand, we have this free will by which we could choose to participate with our nature, or we can make the choice to not participate in this pursuit of our happiness. So there's something very profound here, and she I think she mentions in a chapter, maybe I considered this, but it's almost as if this is kind of a sign of our Creator within us. The dog doesn't have it, the tree doesn't have it, but we have it, that we're able to, as we're moving to our perfection, it is us and our freedom that participates with our nature to move us in that direction. Now, this also answers the question that many atheists will offer. If there is a God, then why would he create a world that has evil in it? Surely you've heard that question. But I think this answers it, because as humans, we have the freedom. But what is the purpose of the freedom? The purpose of the freedom is actually for us to move along our tendencies to the perfection of our nature. So we're here, we want to be perfected, we want to be there. We have this freedom to actually engage this process, to follow the tendencies of our nature, to recognize that they exist, that's the intellect, and then to pursue them, that's the will. We have this freedom to do that or to not do it. But the purpose of the freedom is actually to achieve the end, correct? Kind of like this hammer. The purpose of this hammer is to drive a nail, but it could be misused. It could be used for something evil, correct? So it's the same with our freedom. It could be misused, but just like the hammer is not made to do evil things, neither is our freedom. Our freedom is not for the purpose of doing evil things. It's not for avoiding the fulfillment of our nature. It's for the purpose of perfecting our nature. And I just think there's something very beautiful there, something to be reflected upon, that we are the creatures. Of course, we're not considering angels in this whole discussion right now, but of all of of material creation. We are the ones that have this reflection of our Creator, in which we are free to follow our tendencies or free to reject our tendencies. All right, so the first principle of the natural moral law. How can we know this? How can we know the first principle? I'm going to pause here and go back, remind you of chapter 1. Hopefully you saw that video. Hopefully you read that chapter. We spent quite a bit of time on this concept of first principles in chapter 1. She spends a lot of time on this. First principles, just quickly to review, first principles are self-evident truth. When you see it, you know it. As soon as you perceive it, you're aware of what it is. Once you know the terms or the vocabulary words that relate, like hammer. Once you know what a hammer is, you see this, you're like, okay, those things correspond. This is a hammer. It's self-evident. The word corresponds directly with what you're perceiving. Those are first principles. Back in the first chapter, she gives examples. I think she gave 5 or 6. And here in this chapter, she recalls one of them just for review. It was the principle of identity, in which she said that it is self-evident to every human person that the piano is the piano and it's not a tree. And we could use the same thing here in our video. This hammer is actually this singular numerical hammer right here. It's not that apple, which, notice the apple has survived another week, so we'll see how much further we can go with the apple. But once you understand the terms, then you understand the concept immediately. There's no reasoning that goes into this. There's no thinking about it. There's no pausing and let me think about. There's none of that. It's just self-evident. So another example that she gives in this particular chapter, she says that the whole is greater than the parts. And you must have heard that principle before. That principle is self-evident. Once you understand what it means to say that something is a whole and that something else is a part of a whole, then you immediately understand that the whole is greater than the parts. Now, these first principles become a foundation by which we are able to build other knowledge. So if you think about child development, children recognize first principles, and then their parents and their teachers build upon those first principles to increase their knowledge to things that are reasoned. For example, I don't know if this is the best example in the world, but I have this hammer, so I'm probably going to keep picking it up and using it as an example. The first principle is that this is a hammer. To drive a nail into a 2x4, you have to understand first what a hammer is, and then from that knowledge, we can build upon hammering a nail into wood, putting 2 pieces of wood together, 3 pieces of wood together, building a wall, attaching the wall to a foundation, and then putting a roof on top. Excuse me. And then we've gone from this first principle all the way to the knowledge of building a house, but we built it upon first this first principle. So another clarification that we need to make. In the first chapter, she spoke about first principles of knowing. Remember, as humans, we have the power of, or the capacity of intellect to know truth, and we also have the capacity of will to desire the good, to pursue the good, to do good. So we have these 2 capacities, higher rational capacities. We're the only creatures in material creation that have this, to know the truth and to do good. The first principles that she spoke about, and I alluded to this in that first video, the first principles that she spoke about in that first chapter were principles of knowing. The one I just mentioned, the principle of identity, or the principle that the whole is greater than the parts, those are all principles of knowing. But since we're doing moral theology, we also need to discuss principles of doing, because should I do this act or should I not do this act? That's our subject matter. So we're going to make this transition from first principles of knowing now to first principles of doing. And this one that I have on the screen is actually the primary first principle of doing. They are, again, self-evident. They're known in and of themselves. Once you understand the terms, then you know the principle. It's immediately apparent to you. So in this case, do good and avoid evil. Once you know what it means to be good or to do good, once you know what good means, and once you understand what evil means, then you understand immediately that this is true. So let me break this out a little bit. If good is something that fulfills or perfects our natures, and that's what we're pursuing, is the perfection of our nature, that's what will make us happy, then that's what I should do. You see, it's self-evident. And if evil is the opposite of that, not which fulfills my nature, but which frustrates my nature, then that is something that I should avoid doing. So I should do evil, and I should do good, and I should avoid evil. So this principle, this first principle, primary first principle, is self-evident. Now, she's going to clarify here, and it's important to kind of mention this here. As we move forward, we're going to keep referring back to first principles are self-evident. Everyone knows them everywhere and in every situation. There are exceptions to this. First and foremost, newborn infants, for example, they're not going to know or understand or perceive first principles immediately. There's obviously some growth and development that needs to occur in the life of this child before they're going to understand and perceive first principles. We typically will say that a child reaches the age of reasoning at age 7. And at that age, we typically understand that they're aware of first principles, they can perceive first principles, understand first principles, and they can reason with them. We're going to speak about that in just a minute. So, of course, they can recognize first principles as they're growing, but it's at this age of reason at age 7 that we understand that they understand first principles and they can work with them to reason to further knowledge. Also, there are other circumstances, perhaps health situations, that can present an impediment to a person recognizing first principles, whether that's a temporary health situation or a permanent health situation. But generally speaking, a human being who has no impediments and who has grown is going to they're going to recognize and be aware and understand first principles, and they're going to be able to work with them to reason to further knowledge. All right, so I also want to point out here, I think this is really interesting, she points this out, that this first principle that we said, so perhaps you get into this discussion with atheists or moral relativists who don't accept an objective moral norms. We have a lot of that in our society today. What we just did, or what she presents here, is it's objective. It's an objective norm. I've got the Bible sitting here on the table. It's been sitting here for now 6 episodes, and I have not cracked it once. The reason for that is I wanted to present all of this and make it apparent, to make it obvious that I'm not appealing to divine revelation, that you can perceive objective moral norms without referring to Scripture, to what God gave us. Now, to kind of break that out a little bit, what we established, that you should do good and avoid evil, that's based upon our nature. So we have this tendency that's moving towards the good, and anything that is opposite of the good would frustrate my nature. We would call that evil. So I want to perfect my nature. I don't want to frustrate my nature. So I should do good and I should avoid evil. So this is based on the perfection of our nature. So there's something objective here. Now, I do want to clarify that this moral norm, or this moral code, is objective in, properly speaking, in that it is God's eternal law. But whereas it's a good reflection of God's eternal law, then we can say that it is objective, it's unchangeable, it is it's perfect and it's obvious. So, okay, that brings us now to secondary principles. So, secondary principles are, because we're rational creatures, we can take the first principles and we can reason to further truths from them. And we spoke a lot about this in the first chapter when we were speaking about first principles of knowing. Now we're going to speak about it when it comes to first principles of doing. So, given the first principle, the primary first principle that we just gave, to do good and to avoid evil, it can very easily be reasoned from here to do harm to no one, because doing harm to someone would be a form of evil. And that would frustrate my nature or would frustrate their nature. And my objective is to perfect my nature. So I should harm no one. Now, when we understand these vocabulary words, the terms killing, stealing, lying, when we understand them as forms of harming someone, now I'm presupposing killing an evil person, killing an innocent person in this example here. Of course, somebody's going to comment about the death penalty or something like that. I'm presupposing an innocent person here. But anyways, if you understand the term to kill, if you understand the term to steal, if you understand the term to lie as forms of harming someone, it should be readily available to your mind that I should not do those things, because those would be harming someone, and I should do good and avoid evil. So you may have noticed that this is some of the content of the Ten Commandments. So notice right here, from the primary first principle, we can go pretty quickly, we can reason to the content of the Ten Commandments. Still haven't touched divine revelation yet. We're still just reasoning. From an apparent truth, do good, avoid evil, we can now reason to do no harm to anyone, which includes do not kill, do not steal, do not lie. So you can see that the Ten Commandments, the content of the Ten Commandments, is now something that can be reasoned very easily from first principles, and we call these secondary principles. Okay, they come directly from a reasoning with the first principles. So this does bring up the question: if secondary principles, the Ten Commandments, can be reasoned easily from the first principles, why did God reveal them? Why does this element of divine revelation exist? Why didn't he just leave it to us to reason for ourselves? Well, the answer to that can be seen kind of in our experience of human nature when we look around us. Perhaps this was not the case in the Garden of Eden. Perhaps Adam and Eve, had they both wanted to ice skate or play violin or play the piano or do math, they would have both equally been as proficient at the violin had they both pursued the violin in the Garden of Eden. But our condition now, because of fallen human nature, we have what's called a dullness in our intellect, and we see that all around us. So our experience of human nature is that there's a variety of abilities. So it may be that you are quite proficient at playing the violin. Now, I could be better than you at the violin, but I'm not proficient. So for me to achieve the degree or the level on the violin that you have, I will have to work harder, and I will have to take a longer amount of time to do it. It will take much more effort for me to do what you can do. And you can use this example with, sports or whatever the example is. I think probably the most immediate, obvious example is math. If you think back to math class, in the classroom, there's these principles that are being presented by the teacher, and some of the students are immediately picking them up, and they're like, oh yeah. And other students are scratching their head like, what? Can you do that again? They're struggling with it. It's not that they can't achieve what the other students have. It's just because of this, what we call dullness of the intellect, it's going to take them more work or more effort, or perhaps the teacher needs to teach it in a different way, which is also true. So anyways, because of this, because the secondary principles have to be reasoned, then there's a little bit of effort, a little bit of work that needs to take place from first principles to secondary principles. God gave us this gift by revealing the Ten Commandments to us so that there would be no question about what is right and what is wrong. And she says that he confirmed nature's constant urge to goodness and at the same time brought man to a quicker, fuller, firmer, clearer knowledge of nature's good sooner than an individual man could otherwise have attained it. So man could have reasoned these things himself. We just did with those 3 examples I gave. But God gives us this gift, so there's no question left that these should not, these things, are they immoral? Are they moral? There's no confusion about it. All right, here at the degree of secondary principles, if primary principles are self-evident, the first principles are self-evident, and they're universally known, right? Secondary principles that we reason from them, easily reason, like the Ten Commandments, they should be universally known as well, especially since they've been revealed. But as we get further and further away, as we reason further and further away from first principles, it becomes more and more and more complicated. And at that point, we can't say that it's necessarily universal anymore because the degree of complexity has increased. And it would be, back to the math analogy, it would be like saying calculus or trigonometry is universal. They're not. I did not take calculus. I think I took a little bit of trigonometry, but I don't remember it, and I surely didn't do well at it. But some people have taken trigonometry and calculus, and they do well at it. Now, I took general math. I struggled with general math too. But as you get further and further away from first principles, it does get more and more complicated. Sister's going to discuss St. Thomas Aquinas, who says, as it gets further and further away from first principles and gets more complicated, then it becomes the responsibility of the wise to teach everyone those concepts that are more complicated. Now, this is why we have these roles of authority in our society: teachers, parents, and then civil leaders. It is at this level that she suggests that civic leaders should establish laws, because once you get so far away and it becomes so complicated, there's some confusion here about what it is that should be done. So we call this positive law, and this is going to become the subject of the next video. We'll go much more deeper into it in the next chapter, but just kind of to illustrate this point here. There's this issue, I think it was the last video, 2 videos ago, we spoke about pro-life, pro-choice issues, and I have to be careful what I say here on this platform, but for the last 30 years, there has been confusion in society about this issue, because perhaps it got so far removed from secondary issue, from first principles, and became secondary and further down the line, that maybe it was confusing for the general population. Now, I disagree with that. I think it is a first principle or close to a first principle that you should not kill an innocent human life, and that was obvious. But I think back in the 70s, it was intentionally confused by they were using terms like, oh, it's just a clump of cells. And people who didn't know what cells were, they didn't know what a clump was, they got confused by this issue, and it's as if it was intentionally moved away from first principles, and it became more and more complicated. So at that point, it would have been proper for civil leaders to step in and establish a law that said this activity is illegal because it's immoral, it's wrong. And that would have settled the issue. People would no longer have been confused. To say, oh, I'm confused, is it a clump of cells or is it a living human creature? They wouldn't have had that confusion because the law would have settled it. It would have said, this is wrong. But that's not what happened. The law was abused and confirmed the confusion, and now we've created more and more and more generations of people who are confused. So the proper role of law is to clarify what might be confusing because it's farther away from first principles. So we're gonna speak more about that in the next chapter, but that's really worth reflecting on. What is the purpose of civil laws? We're speaking about civil law. The proper term is positive law. When we speak about civil law, a positive law is a law that is established by a prince or a mayor or the king or even a church leader. They establish a law for the purpose of helping to guide people. Now, this particular law we're mentioning actually confused people, unfortunately. Okay, so back to first principles. First principles are known everywhere by everyone, and therefore they're universal and they're unchanging. But as we get further away from first principles and we start to get into secondary principles and down the line, there is the possibility that the circumstances, if you remember a couple of videos ago, we talked about the act, the intention, and the circumstances. There is the possibility that the circumstances might affect the morality of an act here at the level of secondary principles. For example, it is good for me to return a borrowed knife. However, if the particular circumstances of this situation right now is that the person I borrowed the knife from has now become enraged and become a madman, then it would no longer be a good for me to return the knife to that individual. It would be, perhaps an evil. Now, that's not going to happen at the level of first principles, but as we get further and further away from first principles, that's where the circumstances are going to come into play. So Sister is going to close this chapter by introducing an important term, the word conscience. Conscience is so abused in our time. We've come to use it in the way of saying, I've got to follow my conscience. And by that, people typically mean they're going to do what they want to do. They're going to carry out their preference. They're going to, like, I have this thing that I want to do is normally it would be very immoral, but I really want to do it. I can't control myself. So I'm going to follow my conscience and do it. We see that that's the way that it's being used in modern times a lot. So to clarify what the word properly means is it's an intellectual act or an act of reasoning. So we've spoken about this capacity that the human person has to know truth, right? And in this process of knowing truth, we're reasoning. We're being presented with different truths. The math example would be good. 2 + 3. We're given this information, and we can combine these things together and reason to another truth. Then 2 + 3 is 5. So we've taken this that we've been given, and we're reasoning to something else. So the conscience is what the intellect does when it's given moral information. And it reasons to the proper. It reasons the circumstances that you're currently in, and comes to a conclusion about what I should do right now. So you take the natural moral law, the circumstances that you currently are in, and you reason through those to come to a conclusion about what you should do in the circumstance. So I made this syllogism here. I think I put it up earlier, but it says, I must do good and avoid evil. This particular act is evil. Therefore, I must avoid this act. So you can see how I've taken the moral code, the objective moral code, I've applied it to the circumstances that currently exist in my situation right now, and I've reasoned to a particular conclusion at the end. I've done the act. This is called conscience. And every act of conscience should derive its judgment from a proper and informed understanding of the objective norm of God's eternal law. Conscience should reflect as perfectly as we are capable this objective moral norm that God's established in eternal law and is reflected in natural law and the natural moral law. Now, we will discuss positive law or civil law in the next video about chapter 7, and you can watch that video by clicking right here.